You have ideas, and AI gives you the tools to bring them to life. With generative image and video models, you can realize visions that would have otherwise remained in the drawer forever. Today, I'll show you the fastest way from an idea to your first AI image. Hello, I'm Toby, and this is the AI Film Workshop. Here, I'll guide you step by step through the basics of generative AI for photos and videos. You'll learn how to assemble complete films with AI with all the necessary elements. Before we truly begin, a quick overview. Generative AI can create videos from text or from an image in combination with a prompt. Here in this tutorial, we'll focus solely on videos generated from images combined with a text prompt. Why? Because it gives you maximum control. You precisely design the initial image, composition, lighting style, and only then add movement. This way, you determine very precisely how your video should look.
It is so good to see you again.
Are you sure it's safe to be here?
And with that, let's just get started. This here is a video created from an image that I generated here in the Google AI Studio. Imagen 4 is Google's latest image model, and you can use it very simply here in the Studio app. Of course, there are countless generative AI image generators out there now, all with their strengths and weaknesses, but today I'll focus on two candidates, Imagen 4 and Midjourney. With these two, you can create images like these, and in my opinion, they are two of the most common and best image models. But in the description below, you'll find links not only to all the tools and platforms we're using here today, but also to all other relevant AI models that can create images and videos. Let's start with a very simple prompt. Here I want to see a violinist who is backstage, a portrait of him or a close-up. Here with a relatively telephoto lens. I've also made a few notes about the lighting, so there should be practicals visible, meaning light sources that are also in the image, and it should generally be daylight. There should be a depth of field, which naturally results from the telephoto lens, and a lens flare, which might come from the light falling through a window, as we wanted daylight. We set 16.9. Today we will primarily work with 16.9 images because we want to generate videos later, and I'm assuming we want to make cinematic videos, meaning horizontal videos, and we select the maximum resolution as always. You can generate multiple images simultaneously, but let's stick to one, and then we're ready to go. And this is the result. Yes, it's not bad at all. Practicals, there are indeed light sources in the image, another one here, although that's probably the lens flare. I honestly imagined that a bit differently, but the shallow depth of field is as it should be. Something isn't right with the bow here, it's somewhat distorted, and the hand isn't quite right either, but generally the model implemented what I specified in the prompt. The fact that it became a female violinist, by the way, has to do with me not precisely defining it in the prompt, and with that, we're already on the topic of control. Let's briefly touch upon the basics of image prompting. This isn't meant to be a complete prompt tutorial. There are people who can do that much better than me. I'm just showing you the basics here, which generally work the same for almost all image models. And with that, to rule number 1 of prompting. It's best to think of your prompt as if you were layering different elements. So if you look at this prompt, it first describes the subject, meaning who or what is shown, and if in doubt, also an action, which I don't have here because I simply want to create a portrait. Then it's about the style, for example, photorealistic as here. Importantly, it's best to formulate this very clearly and concisely. After that comes camera. Basically here you can list things like focal length. Then the lighting section, in this case we want to capture really nice golden sunlight. Then it's best to add something about colors. Here a bit pastel, but also whether the image should be particularly high contrast, for example. Then it's best to give the model some information about the image composition. the structure, foreground, background, if there's anything special to consider. Yes, and then you can also specify the aspect ratio. This is, of course, unnecessary in this case because we have already specified this here using the button. On various platforms where different image models are used, it varies whether such selection options exist or not. In this case, they do, which is why I wouldn't include it separately here. Some image models offer the option of working with a negative prompt. There you can write down the things you don't want to see, for example, no bananas, but if that option isn't available, then absolutely do not choose to write these things into the regular prompt, for instance, with no banana, because then you get something like this. These are all images with no banana in the prompt. And yes, of course, no banana at all. No, and clearly, no, that's definitely not a banana. No, it's not even yellow or anything, so you can't really call that a banana. But back to our image. And this is actually a bit, I wouldn't write cinegrain here, so a bit of grain in the image. For me, that actually belongs more to the colors and the overall look, which is why I would actually categorize it here. And from that, this relatively compact sentence emerges, which, however, carries a lot of information within it. And here's the result. And that is, to a large extent, what we prompted. A blonde woman of middle age, she is in the forest. The golden hour is the lighting mood we find here. And leading lines, which I also prompted, well, you can perhaps interpret that here with the light distribution, maybe with the trees, it's somewhat hinted at. But what we naturally see, and that's why it's actually a pretty good example, is that this isn't really a portrait shot or a close-up. It's not what I would expect from an 85mm, but rather a medium shot. Although we prompted the lens quite specifically here, the model apparently didn't quite understand it. And what you can do now to perhaps get closer to what you actually want to see is to clearly state that it should be a close-up. This is something you can always try out with image models, that you simply emphasize information even if it is supposedly already given, and maybe that helps. Yes, we're a bit closer now, but it's still not quite what I would expect here. I'll try it one more time as a super close shot. And that's where we end up. This is more of an image I had imagined, although I have to say the framing or, the crop here, that's complete nonsense with this cutoff head. I have a feeling there's a reason for that. The image model tries to create a close-up on the one hand, and on the other hand, the leading lines that I prompted, and it does so mainly by prominently featuring trees in the image, and then you get an absolute Frankenstein image here. I mean, not the woman, the composition and so on, you know what I mean?
Frankenstein image? What the hell is that supposed to mean?
Oops. Well, that's the second rule when creating images. Check your prompt for logic. If one part clashes with another or even contradicts it, then correct that. And now our portrait looks like this. This is much, much closer to what I had imagined in my mind when prompting. What I don't like so much here is the skin texture. It's a bit too smooth and unnatural for me, but there will be another work step later for that. The so-called upscaling, where we will work on this skin in great detail. By the way, the best images are created when you have a very precise idea of what you want to see. Here, for example, I wanted this photo model. Oops, that wasn't how it was intended. At this point, it's not even about videos yet, but as I said about the image here, I simply wanted to place the model in a museum flooded with light. And the shadows in the image were supposed to be very dominant. Man, what's going on here? Okay, whatever. Now let's take 3 steps back to the creation of our image. Here, one detail was particularly important to me, namely that this one picture hangs on the wall back there, and that the lady is wearing a blue dress. And the fact that I could vividly imagine this image in my mind also leads directly to rule number 3. The image in your head is the best prompt template. And if you look at it, it's already the case that I follow the basic structure, just as we looked at it earlier, but I fill the whole thing with more life, with what I imagine. And because the photo model in the blue dress is a central element of the motif for me, but actually the architecture and the lighting were so important to me, The prompt is also structured a bit differently. I first start with the description of the environment, and then the model comes into play. Then I'll add a bit about the atmosphere, lighting mood, and overall style. And I forego overly detailed camera and technical descriptions. Here are a few more variants with slightly altered prompts, which I also find very successful. Here, for example, I wanted the model to wear a long dress, and I really like the result, because I find it interesting that she is somehow the center of the image, but at the same time is in the shadow. And that, for me, is the perfect collaboration with an AI model, because on the one hand, I very specifically provide my visual idea, on the other hand, I get creative input back, which results in my idea being interpreted in different ways. Speak your mind. That's the fourth rule of prompting. While AI image generators only understood very structured language until recently, you can now work much more intuitively with them. These are a few results that I generated using only prompts, which you can also see below, that simply describe a, let's call it, wild stream of thoughts from my head, which I often just dictate into ChatGPT via voice input, where the whole thing is then condensed into a formulated prompt. This may sound a bit contradictory to the first rule of prompting, which we looked at right at the beginning, namely that you should give the prompt a certain structure. But in my opinion, it all comes together in the end if you combine both rules by intuitively providing the input you have in mind, but at the same time keeping in mind that you pack the individual pieces of information into coherent semantic units, such as the topic of technology, camera, or even lighting, and thus formulate the prompt into a meaningful structure that makes it easier for the AI model to work. And with that, we come to the next topic, namely, accept your limits, or rather, the limits of your image model. This is a series of images, which I generated here in the Google AI Studio gradually. And we don't need to look at the prompt in detail now, because what I want to show is that I actually wanted a realistic, or let's say a cinematic look. And I even specified that in the prompt. But no matter how many times I tried, I just couldn't get it. Somehow all the images look rather semi-realistic, a bit like sketches that have been drawn. And from that arises the next and fifth rule, namely, if it's the wrong tool, then it's the wrong tool. Should you not make progress with an image model after the 8th attempt, then don't struggle, but simply switch to the next one. And we're doing that in this case too. We're simply taking the same prompt and now going to Reve. Actually, I didn't want to demonstrate Reve here, but we'll jump in quickly so I can show you what a switch, let's say to the right weapon, can actually do. The interface here on Reve's website is no different from that of many other AI image generators. Here, I'll now paste the prompt. Then, as always, you set the aspect ratio here, 16:9. Here's also the number of desired images, and prompt enhancement. Always turn that off. The idea behind it is that your prompt is automatically optimized, but definitely turn it off, because otherwise you lose control over your prompt, and besides, you've thought very carefully about how your prompt is structured, right? Yes, and these images are, of course, significantly more realistic. This is much, much closer to the look I had imagined. Here's another comparison to one of the images from Imagen 4. And I have to say, this is really a whole different ball game now. Much, much better. It's almost a bit too realistic for me, because actually I wanted more of a cinematic look. I'm losing that a bit with this realism here. But it's definitely much closer. I'm going to do one more thing to optimize here. I am changing the shot size again, because I have a feeling that might make the whole thing a bit better, because then more background will come into the picture. Let's see. What I particularly like about Reve is this clarity, the arrangement of the images, and also how quickly it works here, how quickly the images are always generated. It's really pleasant to work with Reve. And I really think this one is really good. I admit, I didn't actually want such a back view, but I still really like the image because it somehow builds tension, and I can easily imagine it as the beginning of a video sequence. Yeah, for example, like this. This is just a small interjection to give you a feel for what can become of these images. But either way, what I would actually do at this point, if I were involved in a film project, would be to continuously optimize the image via prompt until I've reached, Let's say about 90% of the shot I need for my film, but then I would optimize the last details with another function, namely with the so-called AI image editing. And as luck would have it, you can do that directly here in Reve by simply clicking the, yes, of course, edit button at the top. And then, for example, I can select this somewhat misplaced rocket here at the top. I can do that here on the side, where individual objects in the image are already offered to me, or I can select it directly in the image and then click on the small trash can, and then apply. And just like that, the rocket is gone, into oblivion or into orbit or wherever. With this image editing, you can do much, much more. I won't go into detail here because there will be a separate episode of the AI film workshop for that. And by the way, we'll also be dealing a lot with Nano Banana there. That's Google's super powerful image editing model, which you can also use here in Google Studio, for example. For now, after this little detour to Reve, let's just hold on to this. Some AI models are better suited for the image you might want to create, and some are worse. I'll show you an overview of which tool is perfect for which situation at the end of this episode. And with that, we come to Midjourney, perhaps the most significant platform for image creation with generative AI. Most of you will know Midjourney because it was the first web-based platform with which you could create really good images. Here you can see a few images that were created with Midjourney, and also a few videos, because on Midjourney you can now also directly create videos from the images you have created. A lot has happened on the platform, both in terms of functionalities and the quality of the images, but it must also be said that a lot has happened overall in the landscape of generative AI for image creation, and that's why Midjourney, even though many still consider it the very best image model, is in my eyes only conditionally so. It's true, as you can see here, the images you can create with it are sometimes very impressive, but Midjourney is relatively complicated to operate and relatively complicated to prompt. It's a bit like it's the professional application, even if it's still a cloud-based solution, but you have a lot of control options, and that's why a lot can go wrong, but you can also create really good images if you know how to. Here we are on Midjourney's interface, and I don't want to do a complete Midjourney tutorial now. There's no room for it here, as the tool is simply too complex. I will only explain a few basic functions here that are important so that we can quickly get to results from which we can then also make videos. Of course, we start with the prompt, as always. I just told you that it's best to prompt when you have a relatively concrete idea in mind, and that's the case here. I want to see a jazz player in a foggy alley, and at the same time, there's also a woman in the background, wearing a red dress, observing the jazz trumpeter a bit in the shadows. This sketch has nothing to do with the prompt, by the way, but you could also use it in the prompt. How to prompt with sketches, we won't discuss here now. That will come in a later tutorial in this series. We'll stick to text input for now. And now we come to the so-called parameters that are used in Midjourney and that have a strong influence on image creation. And what's a bit confusing, especially when you're working with Midjourney for the first time, is that you can enter these parameters in two ways. Namely, here you can see in the settings. Here I can, for example, choose stylization to a certain degree, weirdness and variety. At the same time, I can also do this directly in the prompt, and that with 2 hyphens each. This is C, which is the chaos parameter, and then I can enter a value here. Chaos is, confusingly, variety, and that's where it begins. You really need to know Midjourney quite well to truly understand what you're controlling and how. Chaos, for example, means how much the image model adheres to the prompt when generating the image, or how much freedom it takes to interpret the prompt, let's say. Here's a result of the same prompt with a low chaos value, and here with a high chaos value of approximately 20. In short, the other parameters we see here, of course, is the aspect ratio. You can specify 16.9 or, for example, portrait 916. Here you can also select a mode, either RAW or standard. RAW tends to produce, I'd call them, more authentic images, but that also depends on the model version you select, which you can determine here. 7 is the newest, and you can also go back to older versions, and because the mode is very different across the various model versions, I would actually always work with RAW, because in my opinion, it produces more natural images. Speed, fast turbo, that has a bit to do with billing. With turbo, as the name suggests, the images are simply created much faster, but it costs more tokens. Before generating, what I recommend to everyone is using the parameter R, which means running the prompt multiple times. Midjourney generates 4 images for each iteration of this prompt in these squares here. And if I now say repeat 4 times, that means there are a total of 16 results that I can look at, and we'll do that now. By the way, just for completeness, I've adjusted the parameters again so that we create a 16.9 image, and I've reset the chaos value to 0. And by the way, I selected Midjourney's 6.1 version. I don't know why, it's just a gut feeling. I prefer the aesthetic there. And here in the results, we also see the problem that at least I always have with Midjourney. In almost all results, there are rough errors. Namely, the jazz trumpeter is not a male jazz trumpeter, but also a woman and also wears a red dress. That's the biggest issue with Midjourney. It struggles with context. There are many image models that handle this much better. Here you can see a few results from Nano Banana, from Magnific, and from FLUX. While Midjourney tends to simply implement the prompt word for word, the other video models understand from the context that the trumpet player here is very likely a man, if the other person in the image is a woman. But I don't want to completely badmouth Midjourney now, because many people swear by the tool, especially because of features like character referencing. Here, with an image you upload, you can quite reliably incorporate the same person into new images again and again. But I won't go into detail about that here, because there will be a separate video on that. And to once again draw attention to the potential of the tool, here are a few more images that I created with Midjourney. Overall, I use Midjourney whenever I want to create somewhat more abstract motifs. To conclude this video, here's the promised overview of which image AI can be used particularly well for which purposes. With Reve, you're always particularly well equipped, as we've seen, when you want to create images with a lot of realism. Magnific simply makes, in my opinion, the most beautiful images. Imagen from Google, as we've seen, understands quite a bit of context, and can therefore often make the best out of your prompts, even if you haven't written them perfectly. Seedream, the Chinese model from ByteDance, is also super strong at creating realistic images, and you can create images in 4K with it. And Midjourney, clearly, as we have seen, is always the right address if you want to create abstract images. Adobe Firefly has a very special feature. Here you can generate images that are definitely legally secure, because Adobe guarantees you that by using Firefly you will not violate any copyrights. That was the first episode of the AI Film Workshop. We looked at how you turn your ideas into shots as preparation for your first AI film. In the next episode, we'll talk about upscaling. That is how you perfectly prepare your images to then turn them into video sequences. Thank you for watching and have fun generating the first images for your film.